Section 11 of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy, by Padraic Colum. Part 1, Chapter 15. Who was the first of the great Trojan champions to go down before the onset of Patroclus? The first was Sarpedon, who had come with an army to help Hector from a city beyond Troy. He saw the Myrmidons fight round the ships, and break the ranks of the Trojans, and quench the fire on the half-burnt ship. He saw that the warrior who had the appearance of Achilles affrighted the Trojans, so that they turned their horses' heads towards the city. The Myrmidons swept on with Patroclus at their head. Now when he saw him rushing down from the ships, Sarpedon threw a dart at Patroclus. The dart did not strike him. Then Patroclus flung a spear, and struck Sarpedon even at the heart. He fell dead from his chariot, and there began a battle for his body. The Trojans would have carried it into the city, so that they might bury with all honour the man who had helped them, and the Greeks would have carried it away, so that, having his body and his armour, the slaying of Sarpedon might be more of a triumph for them. So a battle for his body went on. Now Sarpedon's comrade, Glaucus, sought out Hector, who was fighting in another part of the battlefield, and he spoke to him reproachfully. "Hector," he said, "art thou utterly forgetful of those who came from their own country to help thee to protect thy father's city? Sarpedon has fallen, and Achilles' Myrmidons would strip him of his armour and bring his body to the ships, that their triumph over him may be greater still. Disgraceful will it be to thee, Hector, if they win that triumph." Hector, when this was said to him, did not delay, but came straight to the spot where Sarpedon had been slain. The Greek who had laid hands upon the body he instantly slew. But as he fought on, it suddenly seemed to Hector that the gods had resolved to give victory to the Greeks, and his spirit grew weary and hopeless within him. He turned his horses' heads towards the city and galloped from the press of battle. Then the Trojans who were fighting round it fled from the body of Sarpedon, and the Greeks took it and stripped it of its armour and carried the body to their ships. It was then that Patroclus forgot the command of Achilles, the command that he was not to bring the battle beyond the ships, and that he was to return when the Trojans were beaten towards their city. Patroclus forgot all that, and he shouted to the immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, that drew his chariot, and slaying warrior after warrior, he swept across the plain and came to the very gates of Troy. Now Hector was within the gates, and had not yet left his chariot. Then there came and stood before him one who was thought to be the god Apollo, but who then had the likeness of a mortal man. "Hector," said he, "why hast thou ceased from the fight? Behold, Patroclus is without the gate of thy father's city. Turn thy horses against him now, and strive to slay him, and may the gods give thee glory." Then Hector bade his charioteer drive his horses through the gate and into the press of battle. He drew near to Patroclus, and Patroclus, leaping down from his chariot, seized a great stone and flung it at Hector's charioteer. It struck him on the brow and hurled him from the chariot. Hector too leaped from the chariot and took his sword in hand. Their men joined Patroclus and joined Hector, and the battle began beside the body of Hector's charioteer. 3 times did Patroclus rush against the ranks of the Trojans, and 9 warriors did he slay at each onset. But the doom of Patroclus was nigh. A warrior smote him in the back and struck the helmet from his head. With its high horsehair crest it rolled beneath the hoofs of the horses. Who was it smote Prince Patroclus then? Men said it was the god Apollo, who would not have had the sacred city of Troy taken until the time the gods had willed it to fall. The spear fell from his hands, the great shield that Achilles had given him dropped on the ground, and all in amaze Patroclus stood. He gave ground and retreated towards his comrades. Then did Hector deal him the stroke that slew. With his great spear he struck, and drove it through the body of Patroclus. Then did Hector exult, crying, "Patroclus, thou didst swear that thou wouldst sack our sacred city, and thou wouldst take from our people their day of freedom. Now thou hast fallen, and our city need not dread thee ever any more.' Then said Patroclus, 'Thou mayst boast now, Hector, although it was not thy stroke that slew me. Apollo's stroke it was that sent me down. Boast of my slaying as thou wilt, but hear my saying and keep it in thy heart. Thy fate is measured, and thee Achilles will slay.' But Hector did not heed what the dying Patroclus said. He took from his body the armour of Achilles that had been a gift from the gods. The body, too, he would have brought within the city that his triumph might be greater, but now Aias came to where Patroclus had fallen, and over the body he placed his great shield. The fight went on, and Hector, withdrawing himself to the plain, put upon himself the armour he had stripped off the body of Patroclus. The armour fitted every limb and joint, and as he put it on, more courage and strength than ever yet he had felt came into the soul of Hector. And the immortal steeds that Patroclus had driven, having galloped from the battle, stood apart and would not move for all that their charioteer would do. They stood apart with their heads bowed, and tears flowed from their eyes down on the ground. And Zeus, the greatest of the gods, saw them and had pity upon them, and spoke to himself, saying, 'Ah, immortal steeds, why did I give ye to King Peleus, whose generations die while ye remain young and undying? Was it that ye should know the sorrows that befall mortal men? Pitiful indeed is the lot of all men upon the earth. Even Hector now, who boasteth in the armour that the gods once gave, will shortly go down to his death, and the city he defendeth will be burned with fire.' So saying, he put courage into the hearts of the immortal steeds, and they went where the charioteer would have them go, and they came safely out of the battle. Now Hector, with the armour of Achilles upon him, gathered his companies together, and brought them up to the battle to win and carry away the body of Patroclus. But each one who laid hands upon that body was instantly slain by Aias. All day the battle went on, for the Greeks would say to each other, 'Comrades, let the earth yawn and swallow us rather than let the Trojans carry off the body of Patroclus.' And on their side the Trojans would say, 'Friends, rather let us all be slain together beside this man than let one of us go backward now.' Now Nestor's son, Antilochus, who was fighting on the left of the battlefield, heard of the slaying of Patroclus. His eyes filled with tears, and his voice was choked with grief, and he dashed out of the battle to bring the grievous tidings to the hut of Achilles. 'Fallen is Patroclus,' he cried, 'and Greeks and Trojans are fighting around his body. And his body is naked now, for Hector has stripped the armour from it.' Then Achilles fainted away, and his head lay in the ashes of his hut. He woke again and moaned terribly. His goddess mother heard the sound of his grief as she sat within the depths of the ocean. She came to him as he was still moaning terribly. She took his hand and clasped it and said, 'My child, why weepst thou?' Achilles ceased his moaning and answered, 'Patroclus, my dear friend, has been slain. Now I shall have no joy in my life save the joy of slaying Hector who slew my friend.' Thetis, his goddess mother, wept when she heard such speech from Achilles. 'Short lived you will be, my son,' she said, 'for it is appointed by the gods that after the death of Hector your death will come.' 'Straightway then let me die,' said Achilles, 'since I let my friend die without giving him help. Oh that I had not let my wrath overcome my spirit! Here I stayed, a useless burden on the earth, while my comrades and my own dear friend fought for their country. Here I stayed, I who am the best of all the Greeks. But now let me go into the battle and let the Trojans know that Achilles has come back, although he tarried long.' 'But thine armour, my son,' said Thetis. 'Thou hast no armour now to protect thee in the battle. Go not into it until thou seest me again. In the morning I shall return, and I shall bring thee armour that Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, shall make for thee.' So she spoke, and she turned from her son, and she went to Olympus where the gods have their dwellings. Now darkness had come down on those who battled round the body of Patroclus, and in that darkness more Greeks than Trojans were slain. It seemed to the Greeks that Zeus had resolved to give the victory to the Trojans and not to them, and they were dismayed. But 4 Greek heroes lifted up the body and put it on their shoulders, and Aias and his brother stood facing the Trojans, holding them back while the 4 tried to bear the body away. The Trojans pressed on, striking with swords and axes, but like a wooded ridge that stretches across a plain and holds back a mighty flood, Aias and his brother held their ground. Achilles still lay in his hut, moaning in his grief, and the servants raised loud lamentations outside the hut. The day wore on, and the battle went on, and Hector strove against Aias and his brother. Then the figure of a goddess appeared before Achilles as he lay on the ground. "Rouse thee, Achilles," she said, "or Hector will drag into Troy the body of thy friend Patroclus." Said Achilles, "Goddess Iris, how may I go into the battle, since the Trojans hold the armour that should protect me?" Said Iris, the messenger of the gods, "Go down to the wall as thou art, and show thyself to the men of Troy, and it may be that they will shrink back on seeing thee and hearing thy voice, and so give those who defend the body of Patroclus a breathing spell." So she said and departed. Then Achilles arose and went down to the wall that had been built around the ships. He stood upon the wall and shouted across the trench, and friends and foes saw him and heard his voice. Around his head a flame of fire arose, such as was never seen before around the head of a mortal man. And seeing the flame of fire around his head, and hearing his terrible voice, the Trojans were affrighted and stood still. Then the Greeks took up the body of Patroclus and laid it on a litter and bore it out of the battle. End of Section 11. Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Padraic Colum. Part 1, Chapter 16. Now Thetis, the mother of Achilles, went to Olympus where the gods have their dwellings, and to the house of Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. That house shone above all the houses on Olympus, because Hephaestus himself had made it of shining bronze. And inside the house there were wonders, handmaidens that were not living, but that were made out of gold, and made with such wondrous skill that they waited upon Hephaestus and served and helped him as though they were living maids. Hephaestus was lame and crooked of foot, and went limping. He and Thetis were friends from old time, for when his mother would have forsaken him because of his crooked foot, Thetis and her sister reared him within one of the ocean's caves, and it was while he was with them that he began to work in metals. So the lame god was pleased to see Thetis in his dwelling, and he welcomed her and clasped her hand, and asked of her what she would have him do for her. Then Thetis, weeping, told him of her son Achilles, how he had lost his dear friend, and how he was moved to go into the battle to fight with Hector, and how he was without armour to protect his life, seeing that the armour that the gods had once given his father was now in the hands of his foe. And Thetis besought Hephaestus to make new armour for her son, that he might go into battle. She no sooner finished speaking than Hephaestus went to his work-bench and set his bellows, 20 there were, working. And the 20 bellows blew into the crucibles and made bright and hot fires. Then Hephaestus threw into the fires bronze and tin and silver and gold. He set on the anvil stand a great anvil, and took in one hand his hammer and in the other hand his tongs. For the armour of Achilles he first made a shield, and then a corselet that gleamed like fire. And he made a strong helmet to go on the head, and shining greaves to wear on the ankles. The shield was made with 5 folds, one fold of metal upon the other, so that it was strong and thick that no spear or arrow could pierce it, and upon this shield he hammered out images that were a wonder to men. The first were images of the sun and the moon, and of the stars that the shepherds and the seamen watch, the Pleiades and the Hyads and Orion and the Bear, that is also called Wain. And below he hammered out the images of 2 cities. In one there were people going to feasts and playing music, and dancing and giving judgments in the market place. The other was a city besieged. There were warriors on the walls, and there was an army marching out of the gate to give battle to those that besieged them. And below the images of the cities he made a picture of a ploughed field, with ploughmen driving their yokes of oxen along the furrows, and with men bringing them cups of wine. And he made a picture of another field, where men were reaping, and boys were gathering the corn, where there was a servant beneath an oak tree making ready a feast, and women making ready barley for a supper for the men who were reaping, and a king standing apart and watching all, holding a staff in his hands, and rejoicing at all he saw. And another image he made of a vineyard, with clusters of grapes that showed black, and with the vines hanging from silver poles. And he showed maidens and youths in the vineyard, gathering the grapes into baskets, and one amongst them, a boy, who played on the viol. Beside the image of the vineyard he made images of cattle, with herdsmen, and with 9 dogs guarding them. But he showed 2 lions that had come up and had seized the bull of the herd, and the dogs and men strove to drive them away, but were affrighted. And beside the image of the oxen he made the image of a pasture land, with sheep in it, and sheepfolds and roofed huts. He made yet another picture, a dancing place with youths and maidens dancing, their hands upon each other's hands. Beautiful dresses and wreaths of flowers the maidens had on, and the youths had daggers of gold hanging from their silver belts. A great company stood around those who were dancing, and amongst them there was a minstrel who played on the lyre. Then all around the rim of the shield Hephaistos, the lame god, set an image of Ocean, whose stream goes round the world. Not long was he in making the shield and the other wonderful pieces of armour, and as soon as the armour was ready Thetis put her hands upon it, and flying down from Olympus like a hawk, brought it to the feet of Achilles, her son. And Achilles, when he saw the splendid armour that Hephaistos the lame god had made for him, rose up from where he lay and took the wonderfully wrought piece in his hands, and he began to put the armour upon him, and none of the Myrmidons who were around could bear to look upon it, because it shone with such brightness, and because it had all the marks of being the work of a god. Chapter 17 Then Achilles put his shining armour upon him, and it fitted him as though it were wings. He put the wonderful shield before him, and he took in his hands the great spear that Chiron the centaur had given to Peleus his father, the spear that no one else but Achilles could wield. He bade his charioteer harness the immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios. Then, as he mounted his chariot, Achilles spoke to the horses. "Xanthos and Balios," he said, "this time bring the hero that goes with you back safely to the ships, and do not leave him dead on the plain, as ye left the hero Patroclus." Then Xanthos the immortal steed spoke, answering for himself and his comrade. "Achilles," he said, with his head bowed and his mane touching the ground, "Achilles, for this time we will bring thee safely back from the battle. But a day will come when we shall not bring thee back, when thou too shalt lie with the dead before the walls of Troy." Then was Achilles troubled, and he said, "Xanthos, my steed, why dost thou remind me by thy prophecies of what I know already, that my death too is appointed, and that I am to perish here, far from my father and my mother and my own land?" Then he drove his immortal horses into the battle. The Trojans were affrighted when they saw Achilles himself in the fight, blazing in the armour that Hephaistos had made for him. They went backward before his onset, and Achilles shouted to the captain of the Greeks, "No longer stand apart from the men of Troy, but go with me into the battle and let each man throw his whole soul into the fight." And on the Trojan side Hector cried to his captains and said, "Do not let Achilles drive you before him. Even though his hands are as irresistible as fire, and his fierceness as terrible as flashing steel, I shall go against him and face him with my spear." But Achilles went on, and captain after captain of the Trojans went down before him. Now amongst the warriors whom he caught sight of in the fight was Polydorus, the brother of Hector, and the youngest of all King Priam's sons. Priam forbade him ever to go into the battle because he loved him as he would love a little child. But Polydoros had gone in this day, trusting to his fleetness of foot to escape with his life. Achilles saw him, and pursued him, and slew him with his spear. Hector saw the death of his brother. Then he could no longer endure to stand aside to order the battle. He came straight up to where Achilles was brandishing his great spear. And when Achilles saw Hector before him he cried out, "Here is the man who most deeply wounded my soul, who slew my dear friend Patroclus. Now shall we two fight each other, and Patroclus shall be avenged by me." And he shouted to Hector, "Now, Hector, the day of thy triumph and the day of thy life is at its end." But Hector answered him without fear, "Not with words, Achilles, can you affright me. Yet I know that thou art a man of might and a stronger man than I. But the fight between us depends upon the will of the gods. I shall do my best against thee, and my spear before this has been found to have a dangerous edge." He spoke, and lifted up his spear and flung it at Achilles. Then the breath of a god turned Hector's spear aside, for it was not appointed that either he or Achilles should be then slain. Achilles darted at Hector to slay him with his spear, but a god hid Hector from Achilles in a thick mist. Then in a rage Achilles drove his chariot into the ranks of the war, and many great captains he slew. He came to Scamandros, the river that flows across the plain before the city of Troy. And so many men did he slay in it that the river rose in anger against him for choking its waters with the bodies of men. Then on towards the city he went like a fire raging through a glen that had been parched with heat. Now on a tower of the walls of Troy Priam the old King stood, and he saw the Trojans coming in a rout towards the city, and he saw Achilles in his armour blazing like a star that is seen at harvest time and is called Orion's dog, the star that is the brightest of all stars, but yet is a sign of evil. And the old man Priam sorrowed greatly as he stood upon the tower and watched Achilles, because he knew in his heart whom this man would slay, Hector, his son, the protector of his city. End of section 12. The Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Padraic Colum. Part 1, Chapter 18. So much of the story of Achilles did Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, hear from the lips of King Menelaus as he sat with his comrade Peisistratus in the king's feasting hall. And more would Menelaus have told them than if Helen, his wife, had not been seen to weep. "Why weepst thou, Helen?" said Menelaus. "Ah, surely I know. It is because the words that tell of the death of Hector are sorrowful to thee." And Helen, the lovely lady, said, "Never did Prince Hector speak a harsh or a hard word to me in all the years I was in his father's house. And if any one upbraided me he would come and speak gentle words to me. Ah, greatly did I lament for the death of noble Hector. After his wife and his mother I wept the most for him. And when one speaks of his slaying I cannot help but weep." Said Menelaus, "Relieve your heart of its sorrow, Helen, by praising Hector to this youth, and by telling your memories of him." "Tomorrow I shall do so," said the lady Helen. She went with her maids from the hall, and the servants took Telemachus and Peisistratus to their sleeping places. The next day they sat in the banqueting hall, King Menelaus and Telemachus and Peisistratus, and the lady Helen came amongst them. Her handmaidens brought into the hall her silver work-basket that had wheels beneath it with rims of gold, and her golden distaff, that with the basket had been presents from the wife of the King of Egypt. And Helen sat in her chair and took the distaff in her hands and worked on the violet-coloured wool that was in her basket. And as she worked she told Telemachus of Troy and of its guardian, Hector. Said Helen, "The old men were at the gate of the city talking over many things, and King Priam was amongst them. It was in the days when Achilles first quarrelled with King Agamemnon. 'Come hither, my daughter,' said King Priam to me. And sit by me and tell me who the warriors are who now come out upon the plain. You have seen them all before, and I would like to have you tell me who such and such a one is. Who is yon hero who seems so mighty? I have seen men who were more tall than he by a head, but I have never seen a man who looked more royal." I said to King Priam, "The hero whom you look upon is the leader of the host of the Greeks. He is the renowned King Agamemnon." "He looks indeed a king," said Priam. "Tell me now who the other warrior is who is shorter by a head than King Agamemnon, but who is broader of chest and shoulder." "He is Odysseus," I said, "who was reared in rugged Ithaca, but who is wise above all kings." And an old man, Antenor, who was by us, said, "That indeed is Odysseus. I remember that he and Menelaus came on an embassy to the assembly of the Trojans. When they both stood up, Menelaus seemed the greater man, but when they sat down Odysseus seemed by far the most stately. When they spoke in the assembly, Menelaus was ready and skilful of speech. Odysseus, when he spoke, held his staff stiffly in his hands and fixed his eyes upon the ground. We thought by the look of him that he was a man of no understanding. But when he began to speak, we saw that no one could match Odysseus. His words came like snowflakes in winter, and his voice was very resonant." And Priam said, "And who is that huge warrior? I think he is taller and broader than any of the rest." "He is great Aias," said I, "who is as a bulwark for the Greeks. And beside him stands Idomeneus, who has come from the island of Crete. Around him stand the Cretan captains." So I spoke, but my heart was searching for a sight of my own two brothers. I did not see them in any of the companies. Had they come with the host, I wondered, and were they ashamed to be seen with the warriors on account of my wrong doing? I wondered as I looked for them. I did not know that even then my two dear brothers were dead, and that the earth of their own dear land held them. Hector came to the gate, and the wives and the daughters of the Trojans came running to him, asking for news of their husbands or sons or brothers, whether they were killed or whether they were coming back from the battle. He spoke to them all and went to his own house. But Andromache, his wife, was not there, and the house dame told him that she had gone to the great tower by the wall of the city to watch the battle, and that the nurse had gone with her, bringing their infant child. So Hector went down the street and came to the gate where we were, and Andromache his wife came to meet him. With her was the nurse who carried the little child that the folk of the city named Astyanax, calling him King of the City because his father was their city's protector. Hector stretched out his arms to the little boy whom the nurse carried, but the child shrank away from him because he was frightened by the great helmet on his father's head with its horsehair crest. Then Hector laughed, and Andromache laughed with him, and Hector took off his great helmet and laid it on the ground. Then he took up his little son and dandled him in his arms, and prayed, "O Zeus, greatest of the gods, grant that this son of mine may become valiant, and that, like me, he may be protector of the city, and thereafter a great king, so that men may say of him as he returns from battle, 'Far greater is he than was Hector his father.'" Saying this, he left the child back in the nurse's arms. And to Andromache his wife, who was that day very fearful, he said, "Dear one, do not be over sorrowful. You urge me not to go every day into the battle, but some days to stay behind the walls. But my own spirit forbids me to stay away from battle, for always I have taught myself to be valiant and to fight in the forefront." So he said, and he put on his helmet again and went to order his men. And his wife went towards the house, looking back at him often and letting her tears fall down. Thou knowest from Menelaus' story what triumphs Hector had thereafter, how he drove the Greeks back to their ships and affrighted them with his 1,000 watchfires upon the plain, how he drove back the host that Agamemnon led when Diomedes and Odysseus and Machaon the healer were wounded, how he broke through the wall that the Greeks had built and brought fire to their ships, and how he slew Patroclus in the armour of Achilles. Chapter 19 King Priam on his tower saw Achilles come raging across the plain, and he cried out to Hector, "Hector, beloved son, do not await this man's onset, but come within the city's walls. Come within that thou mayest live and be a protection to the men and women of Troy, and come within that thou mayest save thy father, who must perish if thou art slain.' But Hector would not come within the walls of the City. He stood holding his shield against a jutting tower in the wall, and all around him were the Trojans, who came pouring in through the gate without waiting to speak to each other to ask who were yet living and who were slain. And as he stood there, he was saying in his heart, 'The fault is mine that the Trojans have been defeated upon the plain. I kept them from entering the City last night against the counsel of a wise man, for in my pride I thought it would be easy to drive Achilles and the Greeks back again and defeat them utterly and destroy their hopes of return. Now are the Trojans defeated and dishonoured, and many have lost their lives through my pride. Now the women of Troy will say, Hector, by trusting to his own might, has brought destruction upon the whole host, and our husbands and sons and brothers have perished because of him. Rather than hear them say this, I shall face Achilles and slay him, and save the City, or if it must be, perish by his spear.' When Achilles came near him, Hector spoke to him and said, 'My heart bids me stand against thee, although thou art a mightier man than I. But before we go into battle, let us take pledges one from the other, with the gods to witness, that if I should slay thee, I shall strip thee of thine armour, but I shall not carry thy body into the City, but give it to thine own friends to treat with all honour, and that if thou shouldst slay me, thou shalt give my body to my friends.' But Achilles said, 'Between me and thee there can be no pledges. Fight, and fight with all thy soldiership, for now I shall strive to make thee pay for all the sorrow thou hast brought to me because of the slaying of Patroclus my friend.' He spoke and raised his spear and flung it, but with his quickness Hector avoided Achilles' spear. And he raised his own, saying, 'Thou hast missed me, and not yet is the hour of my doom. Now is thy turn to stand before my spear.' He flung it, but the wonderful shield of Achilles turned Hector's spear and it fell on the ground. Then was Hector downcast, for he had no other spear. He drew his sword and sprang at Achilles. But the helmet and shield of Achilles let none of Hector's great strokes touch his body. And Achilles got back into his hands his own great spear, and he stood guarding himself with his shield and watching Hector for a spot to strike him on. Now in the armour that Hector wore, the armour that he had stripped off Patroclus, there was a point at the neck where there was an opening. As Hector came on, Achilles drove at his neck with his spear and struck him, and Hector fell in the dust. Then Achilles stripped from him the armour that Patroclus had worn. The other captains of the Greeks came up and looked at Hector where he lay, and all marvelled at his size and strength and goodliness. And Achilles dragged the body at his chariot and drove away towards the ships. Hector's mother, standing on the tower on the wall, saw all that was done and she broke into a great cry. And all the women of Troy took up the cry and wailed for Prince Hector who had guarded them and theirs from the foe. Andromache, his wife, did not know the terrible thing that had happened. She was in an inner chamber of Hector's house, weaving a great web of cloth and embroidering it with flowers, and she had ordered her handmaidens to heat water for the bath so that Hector might refresh himself when he came in from the fight. But now she heard the wail of the women of Troy. Fear came upon her, for she knew that such wailing was for the best of their warriors. She ran from her chamber and out into the street, and came to the battlements where the people stood watching. She saw the chariot of Achilles dashing off towards the ships, and she knew that it dragged the dead body of Hector. Then darkness came before her eyes and she fainted away. Her husband's sisters and his brothers' wives thronged round her and lifted her up. And at last her life came back to her and she wailed for Hector. 'O my husband,' she cried, 'for misery were we two born. Now thou hast been slain by Achilles and I am left husbandless. Ah, woe for our young child! Hard-hearted strangers shall oppress him when he lives amongst people that care not for him or his. And he will come weeping to me, his widowed mother, who will live for ever sorrowful, thinking upon where thou liest, Hector, by the ships of those who slew thee.' So Andromache spoke, and all the women of Troy joined in her grief and wept for great Hector who had protected their city. Section 14 of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Padraic Colum. Part 1, Chapter 20. Now that Hector was dead, King Priam, his father, had only one thought in his mind, and that was to get his body from Achilles and bring it into the city, so that it might be treated with the honour befitting the man who had been the guardian of Troy. And while he sat in his grief, thinking of his noble son lying so far from those who would have wept over him, behold, there appeared before him Iris, the messenger of Zeus, the greatest of the gods. Iris said to him, "King, thou mayest ransom from Achilles the body of Hector thy noble son. Go thou thyself to the hut of Achilles, and bring with thee great gifts to offer him. Take with thee a wagon that thou mayst bring back in it the body, and let only one old henchman go with thee to drive the mules." Then Priam, when he heard this, arose and went into his treasure chamber, and took out of his chests 12 beautiful robes, 12 bright-coloured cloaks, 12 soft coverlets, and 10 talents of gold. He took, too, 4 cauldrons and 2 tripods, and a wonderful goblet that the men of Thrace had given him when they had come on an embassy to his city. Then he called upon his sons, and he bade them make ready the wagon and load it with the treasures he had brought out of his treasure chamber. When the wagon was loaded and the mules were yoked under it, and when Priam and his henchmen had mounted the seats, Hecabe, the queen, Priam's wife and the mother of Hector, came with wine and with a golden cup that they might pour out an offering to the gods before they went on their journey, that they might know whether the gods indeed favoured it or whether Priam himself was not going into danger. King Priam took the cup from his wife, and he poured out wine from it, and looking towards heaven he prayed, "O Father Zeus, grant that I may find welcome under Achilles' roof, and send, if thou wilt, a bird of omen, so that seeing it with mine own eyes I may go on my way, trusting that no harm will befall me." He prayed, and straightway a great eagle was seen with wide wings spread out above the city, and when they saw the eagle the hearts of the people were glad, for they knew that their king would come back safely and with the body of Prince Hector, who had guarded Troy. Now Priam and his henchmen drove across the plain of Troy and came to the river that flowed across, and there they let their mules drink. They were greatly troubled, for dark night was coming down, and they knew not the way to the hut of Achilles. They were in fear, too, that some company of armed men would come upon them and slay them for the sake of the treasures they had in the wagon. The henchmen saw a young man coming towards them, and when he reached them he spoke to them kindly and offered to guide them through the camp and to the hut of Achilles. He mounted the wagon and took the reins in his hands and drove the mules. He brought them to the hut of Achilles and helped Priam from the wagon and carried the gifts they had brought with them. "Know, King Priam," he said, "that I am not a mortal, but that I am one sent by Zeus to help and companion thee upon the way. Go now within the hut and speak to Achilles, and ask him, for his father's sake, to restore to thee the body of Hector, thy son." So he spoke and departed, and King Priam went inside the hut. There great Achilles was sitting, and King Priam went to him and knelt before him and clasped the hands of the man who had slain his son. And Achilles wondered when he saw him there, for he did not know how one could have come to his hut and entered it without being seen. He knew then that it was one of the gods who had guided this man. Priam spoke to him and said, "Bethink thee, Achilles, upon thine own father. He is now of an age with me, and perhaps even now in thy far-away country there are those who make him suffer pain and misery. But however great the pain and misery he may suffer, he is happy compared to me, for he knows that thou, his son, art alive still. But I no longer have him who was the best of my sons. Now for thy father's sake have I come to thee, Achilles, to ask for the body of Hector, my son. I am more pitiable than thy father or any man, for I have come through dangers to take in my hands the hands that slew my son.' Achilles remembered his father and felt sorrow for the old man who knelt before him. He took King Priam by the hand and raised him up and seated him on the bench beside him. And he wept, remembering old Peleus, his father. He called his handmaids and he bade them take the body of Hector and wash it and wrap it in 2 of the robes that Priam had brought. When they had done all this he took up the body of Hector and laid it himself upon the wagon. Then he came and said to King Priam, 'Thy son is laid upon a bier, and at the break of day thou mayst bring him back to the city. But now eat and rest here for this night.' King Priam ate, and he looked at Achilles and he saw how great and how goodly he was. And Achilles looked at Priam, and he saw how noble and how kingly he looked. And this was the first time that Achilles and Priam, the King of Troy, really saw each other. When they gazed on each other, King Priam said, 'When thou goest to lie down, Lord Achilles, permit me to lie down also. Not once have my eyelids closed in sleep since my son Hector lost his life. And now I have tasted bread and meat and wine for the first time since, and I could sleep.' Achilles ordered that a bed be made in the portico for King Priam and his henchmen, but before they went Achilles said, 'Tell me, King, and tell me truly, for how many days dost thou desire to make a funeral for Hector? For so many days' space I will keep back the battle from the city so that thou mayst make the funeral in peace. For 9 days we would watch beside Hector's body and lament for him. On the 10th day we would have the funeral, on the 11th day we would make a barrow over him, and on the 12th day we would fight,' King Priam said. 'Even for 12 days I will hold the battle back from the city,' said Achilles. Then Priam and his henchmen went to rest, but in the middle of the night the young man who had guided him to the hut of Achilles, the god Hermes he was, appeared before his bed and bade him rise and go to the wagon and yoke the mules and drive back to the city with the body of Hector. Priam aroused his henchmen and they went out and yoked the mules and mounted the wagon, and with Hermes to guide them, they drove back to the city. And Achilles on his bed thought of his own fate, how he too would die in battle, and how for him there would be no father to make lament. But he would be laid where he had asked his friends to lay him, beside Patroclus, and over them both the Greeks would raise a barrow that would be wondered at in after times. So Achilles thought, and afterwards the arrow fired by Paris struck him as he fought before the gate of the city, and he was slain even on the place where he slew Hector. But the Greeks carried off his body and his armour and brought them back to the ships. And Achilles was lamented over, though not by old Peleus his father. From the depths of the sea came Thetis his goddess mother, and with her came the maidens of the sea. They covered the body of Achilles with wonderful raiment, and over it they lamented for 17 days and 17 nights. On the 18th day he was laid in the grave beside Patroclus his dear friend, and over them both the Greeks raised a barrow that was wondered at in the after times. Chapter 21 Now Hector's sister was the first to see her father coming in the dawn across the plain of Troy with the wagon upon which his body was laid. She came down to the city and she cried through the streets, "O men and women of Troy, ye who often went to the gates to meet Hector coming back with victory, come now to the gates to receive Hector dead." Then every man and woman in the city took themselves outside the gate. And they brought in the wagon upon which Hector was laid, and all day from the early dawn to the going down of the sun they wailed for him who had been the guardian of their city. His father took the body to the house where Hector had lived, and he laid it upon his bed. Then Hector's wife Andromache went to the bed and cried over the body. "Husband," she cried, "thou art gone from life, and thou hast left me a widow in thy house. Our child is yet little, and he shall not grow to manhood in the halls that were thine, for long before that the city will be taken and destroyed. Ah, how can it stand, when thou, who wert its best guardian, hast perished? The folk lament thee, Hector. But for me and for thy little son, doomed to grow up amongst strangers and men unfriendly to him, the pain for thy death will ever abide." And Hekabe, Hector's mother, went to the bed and cried, "Of all my children thou, Hector, wert the dearest. Thou wert slain because it was not thy way to play the coward. Ever wert thou championing the men and women of Troy without thought of taking shelter or flight. And for that thou wert slain, my son." And I, Helen, went to the bed too, to lament for noble Hector. "Of all the friends I had in Troy thou wert the dearest, Hector," I cried. "Never did I hear one harsh word from thee to me, who brought wars and trouble to thy city. In every way thou wert a brother to me. Therefore I bewail thee with pain at my heart, for in all Troy there is no one now who is friendly to me." Then did the King and the folk of the city prepare for Hector's funeral. On the 10th day, weeping most bitter tears, they bore brave Hector away. And they made a grave for him, and over the grave they put close set stones, and over it all they raised a great barrow. On the 11th day they feasted at King Priam's house, and on the 12th day the battle began anew. End of Section 14. Of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy, by Padraic Colum. Part 1, Chapter 22. For many days Telemachus and his comrade Peisistratus stayed in the house of King Menelaus. On the evening before he departed, Menelaus spoke to him of the famous deeds of his father Odysseus. "Now Achilles was dead," said Menelaus, "and his glorious armour was offered as a prize for the warrior whom the Greeks thought the most of. 2 men strove for the prize, Odysseus and his friend Aias. To Odysseus the armour of Achilles was given, but he was in no way glad of the prize, for his getting it had wounded the proud spirit of great Aias. It was fitting that Odysseus should have been given Achilles' armour, for no warrior in the host had done better than he. But Odysseus was to do still greater things for us. He knew that only one man could wield a bow better than Paris, Paris who had shot with an arrow Achilles, and who after that had slain many of our chiefs. That man was Philoctetes. He had come with Agamemnon's host to Troy. But Philoctetes had been bitten by a water snake, and the wound given him was so terrible that none of our warriors could bear to be near him. He was left on the island of Lemnos, and the host lost memory of him. But Odysseus remembered, and he took ship to Lemnos and brought Philoctetes back. With his great bow and with the arrows of Hercules that were his, Philoctetes shot at Paris upon the wall of Troy and slew him with an arrow. And then Odysseus devised the means by which we took Priam's city at last. He made us build a great wooden horse. We built it and left it upon the plain of Troy, and the Trojans wondered at it greatly. And Odysseus had counselled us to bring our ships down to the water, and to burn our stores and make it seem in every way that we were going to depart from Troy in weariness. This we did, and the Trojans saw the great host sail away from before their city. But they did not know that a company of the best of our warriors was within the hollow of the wooden horse, nor did they know that we had left a spy behind to make a signal for our return. The Trojans wondered why the great wooden horse had been left behind, and there were some who considered that it had been left there as an offering to the goddess Pallas Athene, and they thought that it should be brought within the city. Others were wiser and would have left the wooden horse alone. But those who considered that it should be brought within prevailed, and as the horse was too great to bring through the gate, they flung down part of the wall that they might bring it through. The wooden horse was brought within the walls and left upon the streets of the city, and the darkness of the night fell. Now Helen, my wife, came down to where the wooden horse was, and she, suspecting there were armed men within, walked around it 3 times, calling to every captain of the Greeks who might be within in his own wife's voice. And when the sound of a voice that had not been heard for so many years came to him, each of the captains started up to answer, but Odysseus put his hands across the mouth of each and so prevented them from being discovered. We had left a spy hidden between the beach and the city. Now when the wooden horse had been brought within the walls and night had fallen, the spy lighted a great fire that was a signal to the ships that had sailed away. They returned with the host before the day broke. Then we who were within the wooden horse broke through the boards and came out on the city with our spears and swords in our hands. The guards beside the gates we slew and made a citadel of the wooden horse and fought around it. The warriors from the ships crossed the wall where it was broken down, and we swept through the streets and came to the citadel of the King. Thus we took Priam's city and all its treasures, and thus I won back my own wife, the lovely Helen. But after we had taken and sacked King Priam's city, great troubles came upon us. Some of us sailed away, and some of us remained on the shore at the bidding of King Agamemnon to make sacrifice to the gods. We separated, and the doom of death came to many of us. Nestor I saw at Lesbos, but none other of our friends have I ever since seen. Agamemnon, my own brother, came to his own land. But it would have been happier for him if he had died on the plain of Troy, and if we had left a great barrow heaped above him. For he was slain in his own house and by one who had married the wife he had left behind. When the Ancient One of the Sea told me of my brother's doom, I sat down upon the sand and wept, and I was minded to live no more, nor to see the light of the sun. And of thy father, Telemachus, I have told thee what I myself know and what was told me of him by the Ancient One of the Sea, how he stays on an island where the nymph Calypso holds him against his will. But where that island lies I do not know. Odysseus is there, and he cannot win back to his own country, seeing that he has no ship and no companions to help him to make his way across the sea. But Odysseus was ever master of devices. And also he is greatly favoured by the goddess Pallas Athene. For these reasons, Telemachus, be hopeful that your father will yet reach his own home and country.' Chapter 23 Now the goddess Pallas Athene had thought for Telemachus, and she came to him where he lay in the vestibule of Menelaus' house. His comrade Peisistratus was asleep, but Telemachus was wakeful, thinking upon his father. Athene stood before him and said to him, 'Telemachus, no longer shouldst thou wander abroad, for the time has come when thou shouldst return. Come, rouse Menelaus, and let him send thee upon thy way.' Then Telemachus woke Peisistratus out of his sleep, and told him that it was best that they should be going on their journey. But Peisistratus said, 'Tarry until it is dawn, Telemachus, when Menelaus will come to us and send us on our way.' Then when it was light King Menelaus came to them. When he heard that they would depart, he told the lady Helen to bid the maids prepare a meal for them. He himself, with Helen his wife, and Megapenthes his son, went down into his treasure chamber and brought forth gifts to Telemachus, a two-handled cup and a great mixing bowl of silver. And Helen took out of a chest a beautiful robe that she herself had made and embroidered. They came to Telemachus where he stood by the chariot with Peisistratus ready to depart. Then Menelaus gave him the beautiful two-handled cup that had been a gift to himself from the King of the Sidonians. Megapenthes brought up the great bowl of silver and put it in the chariot, and beautiful Helen came to him, holding the embroidered robe. 'I too have a gift, dear child, for thee,' she said. 'Bring this robe home and leave it in thy mother's keeping. I want thee to have it to give to thy bride when thou bringest her into thy father's halls.' Then were the horses yoked to the chariot, and Telemachus and Peisistratus bade farewell to Menelaus and Helen, who had treated them so kindly. As they were ready to go, Menelaus poured out of a golden cup wine as an offering to the gods. And as Menelaus poured it out, Telemachus prayed that he might find Odysseus his father in his home. Now as he prayed a bird flew from the right hand and over the horses' heads. It was an eagle, and it bore in its claws a goose that belonged to the farmyard. Telemachus asked Menelaus, was this not a sign from Zeus, the greatest of the gods? Then said Helen, "Hear me now, for I will prophesy from this sign to you. Even as yonder eagle has flown down from the mountain and killed a goose of the farmyard, so will Odysseus come from far to his home and kill the wooers who are there." "May Zeus grant that it be so," said Telemachus. He spoke and lashed the horses, and they sped across the plain. When they came near the city of Pylos, Telemachus spoke to his comrade Peisistratus and said, "Do not take me past my ship, son of Nestor. Thy good father expects me to return to his house, but I fear that if I should, he, out of friendliness, would be anxious to make me stay many days, but I know that I should now return to Ithaca." The son of Nestor turned the horses towards the sea, and they drove the chariot to where Telemachus' ship was anchored. Then Telemachus gathered his followers, and he bade them take on board the presents that Menelaus and Helen had given him. They did this, and they raised the mast and the sails, and the rowers took their seats on the benches. A breeze came and the sails took it, and Telemachus and his companions sailed towards home. And all unknown to the youth, his father Odysseus was even then nearing his home. End of Part 1. End of Section 15. Of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy, by Padraic Colum. Part 2. How Odysseus left Calypso's island and came to the land of the Phaeacians. How he told he fared with the Cyclops, and went past the terrible Scylla and Charybdis, and came to the island of Thrinacia, where his men slaughtered the cattle of the sun. How he was given a ship by the Phaeacians and came to his own land. How he overthrew the wooers who wasted his substance, and came to reign again as king of Ithaca. Chapter 1. Ever mindful was Pallas Athene of Odysseus, although she might not help him openly, because of a wrong he had done Poseidon, the god of the sea. But she spoke at the council of the gods, and she won from Zeus a pledge that Odysseus would now be permitted to return to his own land. On that day she went to Ithaca, and appearing to Telemachus, moved him, as has been told, to go on the voyage in search of his father. And on that day too, Hermes, by the will of Zeus, went to Ogygia, to that island where, as the Ancient One of the Sea had shown Menelaus, Odysseus was held by the nymph Calypso. Beautiful indeed was that island. All round the cave where Calypso lived was a blossoming wood. Alder, poplar and cypress trees were there, and on their branches roosted long-winged birds, falcons and owls and chattering sea-crows. Before the cave was a soft meadow in which thousands of violets bloomed, and with 4 fountains that gushed out of the ground and made clear streams through the grass. Across the cave grew a straggling vine, heavy with clusters of grapes. Calypso was within the cave, and as Hermes came near, he heard her singing one of her magic songs. She was before a loom weaving the threads with a golden shuttle. Now she knew Hermes, and was pleased to see him on her island, but as soon as he spoke of Odysseus and how it was the will of Zeus that he should be permitted to leave the island, her song ceased, and the golden shuttle fell from her hand. "Woe to me," she said, "and woe to any immortal who loves a mortal, for the gods are always jealous of their love. I do not hold him here because I hate Odysseus, but because I love him greatly, and would have him dwell with me here. More than this, Hermes, I would make him an immortal, so that he would know neither old age nor death." "He does not desire to be freed from old age and death," said Hermes. "He desires to return to his own land, and to live with his dear wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. And Zeus, the greatest of the gods, commands that you let him go upon his way." "I have no ship to give him," said Calypso, "and I have no company of men to help him cross the sea." "He must leave the island and cross the sea. Zeus commands it," Hermes said. 'I must help him to make his way across the sea, if it must be so,' Calypso said. Then she bowed her head and Hermes went from her. Straightway Calypso left her cave and went down to the sea. By the shore Odysseus stayed, looking across the wide sea with tears in his eyes. She came to him and she said, 'Be not sorrowful any more, Odysseus. The time has come when thou mayst depart from my island. Come now, I will show how I can help thee on thy way.' She brought him to the side of the island where great trees grew, and she put in his hands a double edged axe and an adze. Then Odysseus started to hew down the timber. 20 trees he felled with his axe of bronze, and he smoothed them and made straight the line. Calypso came to him at the dawn of the next day. She brought augers for boring, and he made the beams fast. He built a raft, making it very broad, and set a mast upon it and fixed a rudder to guide it. To make it more secure he wove out of osier rods a fence that went from stem to stern as a bulwark against the waves, and he strengthened the bulwark with wood placed behind. Calypso wove him a web of cloth for sails, and these he made very skilfully. Then he fastened the braces and the halyards and sheets, and he pushed the raft with levers down to the sea. That was on the 4th day. On the 5th Calypso gave him garments for the journey and brought provision down to the raft: 2 skins of wine and a great skin of water, corn and many dainties. She showed Odysseus how to guide his course by the star, that some call the Bear and others the Wain. And she bade farewell to him. He took his place on the raft and set his sail to the breeze, and he sailed away from Ogygia, the island where Calypso had held him for so long. But not easily or safely did he make his way across the sea. The winds blew upon his raft and the waves dashed against it. A fierce blast came and broke the mast in the middle. The sail and the armyard fell into the deep. Then Odysseus was flung down on the bottom of the raft. For a long time he lay there overwhelmed by the water that broke over him. The winds drove the raft to and fro. The south wind tossed it to the north to bear along, and the east wind tossed it to the west to chase. In the depths of the sea there was a nymph who saw his toils and his troubles and who had pity on him. Ino was her name. She rose from the waves in the likeness of a seagull, and she sat upon the raft and she spoke to Odysseus in words. 'Hapless man,' she said, 'Poseidon, the god of the sea, is still wroth with thee. It may be that the waters will destroy the raft upon which thou sailest. Then there would be no hope for thee. But do what I bid thee, and thou shalt yet escape. Strip off thy garments, and take this veil from me and wind it around thy breast. As long as it is upon thee thou canst not drown. But when thou reachest the mainland, loose the veil and cast it into the sea, so that it may come back to me.' She gave him the veil, and then in the likeness of a seagull she dived into the sea, and the waves closed over her. Odysseus took the veil and wound it around his breast, but he would not leave the raft as long as its timbers held together. Then a great wave came and shattered the raft. He held himself on a single beam as one holds himself on a horse, and then with the veil bound across his breast he threw himself into the waves. For 2 days and 2 nights he was tossed about on the waters. When on the 3rd day the dawn came and the winds fell, he saw land very near. He swam eagerly towards it. But when he drew nearer he heard the crash of waves as they struck against rocks that were all covered with foam. Then indeed was Odysseus afraid. A great wave took hold of him and flung him towards the shore. Now would his bones have been broken upon the rocks if he had not been ready-minded enough to rush towards a rock and to cling to it with both hands until the wave dashed by. Its backward drag took him and carried him back to the deep with the skins stripped from his hands. The waves closed over him. When he rose again he swam round looking for a place where there might be, not rocks, but some easy opening into the land. At last he saw the mouth of a river. He swam towards it until he felt its stream flowing through the water of the sea. Then in his heart he prayed to the river. 'Hear me, O river,' was what he said. I am come to thee as a suppliant, fleeing from the anger of Poseidon, god of the sea. Even by the gods is the man pitied who comes to them as a wanderer and a hapless man. I am thy suppliant, O river, pity me and help me in my need.' Now the river water was smooth for his swimming, and he came safely to its mouth. He came to a place where he might land, but with his flesh swollen and streams of salt water gushing from his mouth and nostrils. He lay on the ground without breath or speech, swooning with the terrible weariness that was upon him. But in a while his breath came back to him and his courage rose. He remembered the veil that the sea nymph had given him, and he loosened it and let it fall back into the flowing river. A wave came and bore it back to Ino, who caught it in her hands. But Odysseus was still fearful, and he said in his heart, 'Ah me! What is to befall me now? Here am I, naked and forlorn, and I know not amongst what people I am come. And what shall I do with myself when night comes on? If I lie by the river in the frost and dew, I may perish of the cold, and if I climb up yonder to the woods and seek refuge in the thickets, I may become the prey of wild beasts.' He went from the cold of the river up to the woods, and he found 2 olive trees growing side by side, twining together so that they made a shelter against the winds. He went and lay between them upon a bed of leaves, and with leaves he covered himself over. There in that shelter and with that warmth he lay, and sleep came on him, and at last he rested from perils and toils. End of Section 16. Of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Padraic Colum. Part 2. Chapter 2. And while he rested, the goddess Pallas Athene went to the city of the Phaeacians, to whose land Odysseus had now come. She came to the palace of the king, and passing through all the doors, came to the chamber where the king's daughter, Nausicaa, slept. She entered into Nausicaa's dream, appearing to her in it as one of her girl comrades, and in the dream she spoke to the princess. 'Nausicaa,' she said, 'the garments of your household are all uncared for, and the time is near when, more than ever, you have need to have much and beautiful raiment. Your marriage day will be soon. You will have to have many garments ready by that time, garments to bring with you to your husband's house, and garments to give to those who will attend you at your wedding. There is much to be done, Nausicaa. Be ready at the break of day, and take your maidens with you, and bring the garments of your household to the river to be washed. I will be your mate in the toil. Beg your father to give you a wagon with mules to carry all the garments that we have need to wash.' So in her dream Pallas Athene spoke to the princess in the likeness of her girl friend. Having put the task of washing into her mind, the goddess left the palace of the king and the country of the Phaeacians. Nausicaa, when she rose, thought upon her dream, and she went through the palace and found her father. He was going to the assembly of the Phaeacians. She came to him, but she was shy about speaking of that which had been in her dream, her marriage day, since her parents had not spoken to her about such a thing. Saying that she was going to the river to wash the garments of the household, she asked for a wagon and for mules. 'So many garments have I lying soiled,' she said. 'Yes, and thou too, my father, should have fresh raiment when you go forth to the assembly of the Phaeacians. And in our house are the 2 unwedded youths, my brothers, who are always eager for new washed garments wherein to go to dances.' Her father smiled on her and said, 'The mules and wagon thou mayst have, Nausicaa, and the servants shall get them ready for thee now.' He called to the servants and bade them get ready the mules and the wagon. Then Nausicaa gathered her maids together and they brought the soiled garments of the household to the wagon. And her mother, so that Nausicaa and her maids might eat while they were from home, put in a basket filled with dainties and a skin of wine. Also she gave them a jar of olive oil, that they might rub themselves with oil when bathing in the river. Young Nausicaa herself drove the wagon. She mounted it and took the whip in her hands and started the mules, and they went through fields and by farms and came to the river bank. The girls brought the garments to the stream, and, leaving them in the shallow parts, trod them with their bare feet. The wagon was unharnessed, and the mules were left to graze along the river side. Now when they had washed the garments, they took them to the seashore and left them on the clean pebbles to dry in the sun. Then Nausicaa and her companions went into the river and bathed and sported in the water. When they had bathed, they sat down and ate the meal that had been put on the wagon for them. The garments were not yet dried, and Nausicaa called her companions to play. Straightway they took a ball and threw it from one to the other, each singing a song that went with the game. And as they played on the meadow they made a lovely company, and the Princess Nausicaa was the tallest and fairest and noblest of them all. Before they left the river side to load the wagon they played a last game. The Princess threw the ball, and the girl whose turn it was to catch missed it. The ball went into the river and was carried down the stream. At that they all raised a cry. It was this cry that woke up Odysseus, who, covered over with leaves, was then sleeping in the shelter of the 2 olive trees. He crept out from under the thicket, covering his nakedness with leafy boughs that he broke off the trees. And when he saw the girls in the meadow he wanted to go to them to beg for their help. But when they looked on him they were terribly frightened, and they ran this way and that way and hid themselves. Only Nausicaa stood still, for Pallas Athene had taken fear from her mind. Odysseus stood a little way from her and spoke to her in a beseeching voice. "I supplicate thee, lady, to help me in my bitter need. I would kneel to thee and clasp thy knees, only I fear thine anger. Have pity on me. Yesterday was the 20th day that I was upon the sea, driven hither and thither by the waves and the winds." And still Nausicaa stood, and Odysseus looking upon her was filled with reverence for her, so noble she seemed. "I know not as I look upon thee," he said, "whether thou art a goddess or a mortal maiden. If thou art a mortal maiden, happy must thy father be, and thy mother, and thy brothers. Surely they must be proud and glad to see thee in the dance, for thou art the very flower of maidens. And happy above all will be he who will lead thee home to his bride. Never have my eyes beheld one who had such beauty and such nobleness. I think thou art like to the young palm tree I once saw springing up by the altar of Apollo in Delos, a tree that many marvelled to look at. O lady, after many and sore trials, to thee, first of all the people, have I come. I know that thou wilt be gracious to me. Show me the way to the town, give me an old garment to cast about me, and may the gods grant thee thy wish and thy heart's desire, a noble husband who will cherish thee." She spoke to him as a princess should, seeing that in spite of the evil plight he was in, he was a man of worth. "Stranger," she said, "since thou hast come to our land, thou shalt not lack for raiment, nor aught else that is given to a suppliant. I will show thee the way to the town also." He asked what land he was in. "This, stranger," she said, "is the land of the Phæacians, and Alcinous is king over them, and I am the King's daughter, Nausicaa." Then she called to her companions. "Do not hide yourselves," she said. "This is not an enemy, but a helpless and an unfriended man. We must befriend him, for it is well said that the stranger and the beggar are from God." The girls came back, and they brought Odysseus to a sheltered place, and they made him sit down and laid a garment beside him. One brought the jar of olive oil that he might clean himself when he bathed in the river. And Odysseus was very glad to get this oil, for his back and shoulders were all crusted over with flakes of brine. He went into the river and bathed and rubbed himself with the oil. Then he put on the garment that had been brought him. So well he looked that when he came towards them again, the Princess said to the maids, "Look now on the man who a while ago seemed so terrifying. He is most handsome and stately. Would that we might see more of him. Now, my maidens, bring the stranger meat and drink." They came to him and they served him with meat and drink, and he ate and drank eagerly, for it was long since he had tasted food. And while he ate, Nausicaa and her companions went down to the seashore and gathered the garments that were now dried, singing songs the while. They harnessed the mules and folded the garments and left them on the wagon. When they were ready to go, Nausicaa went to Odysseus and said to him, "Stranger, if thou wouldst make thy way into the city, come with us now, so that we may guide thee. But first listen to what I would say. While we are going through the fields and by the farms, walk thou behind, keeping near the wagon. But when we enter the ways of the city, go no further with us. People might speak unkindly of me if they saw me with a stranger such as thou. They might say, 'Who does Nausicaa bring to her father's house? Someone she would like to make her husband, most likely.' So that we may not meet with such rudeness, I would have thee come alone to my father's house. Listen now, and I will tell thee how thou mayst do this. There is a grove kept for the goddess Pallas Athene within a man's shout of the city. In that grove is a spring, and when we come near I would have thee go and rest thyself by it. Then, when thou dost think we have come to my father's house, enter the city and ask thy way to the palace of the King. When thou hast come to it, pass quickly through the court and through the great chamber, and come to where my mother sits weaving yarn by the light of the fire. My father will be sitting near, drinking his wine in the evening. Pass by his seat and come to my mother, and clasp your hands about her knees and ask for her aid. If she become friendly to thee, thou wilt be helped by our people and wilt be given the means of returning to thine own land." So Nausicaa bade him. Then she touched the mules with the whip and the wagon went on. Odysseus walked with the maids behind. As the sun set they came to the grove that was outside the city, the grove of Pallas Athene. Odysseus went into it and sat by the spring. And while he was in her grove he prayed to the goddess, "Hear me, Pallas Athene, and grant that I may come before the King of this land as one well worthy of his pity and his help." End of section 17. The Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Padraic Colum. Part II, Chapter 3. About the time that the maiden Nausicaa had come to her father's house, Odysseus rose up from where he sat by the spring in the grove of Pallas Athene and went into the city. There he met one who showed him the way to the palace of King Alcinous. The doors of that palace were golden and the door-posts were of silver. And there was a garden by the great door filled with fruitful trees, pear-trees and pomegranates, apple-trees and trees bearing figs and olives. Below it was a vineyard showing clusters of grapes. That orchard and that vineyard were marvels, for in them never fruit fell or was gathered, but other fruit ripened to take its place. From season to season there was fruit for the gathering in the King's close. Odysseus stood before the threshold of bronze, and many thoughts were in his mind. But at last, with a prayer to Zeus, he crossed the threshold and went through the great hall. Now on that evening the captains and the councillors of the Phaeacians sat drinking wine with the King. Odysseus passed by them and stayed not at the King's chair, but went where Arete, the Queen, sat. And he knelt before her and clasped her knees with his hands and spoke to her in supplication. "Arete, Queen, after many toils and perils, I am come to thee and to thy husband and to these thy guests. May the gods give all who are here a happy life, and may each see his children in safe possession of his halls. I have come to thee to beg that thou wouldst put me on my way to my own land, for long have I suffered sore affliction far from my friends." Then, having spoken, Odysseus went and sat down in the ashes of the hearth with his head bowed. No one spoke for long. Then an aged councillor who was there spoke to the King. "O Alcinous," he said, "it is not right that a stranger should sit in the ashes by thy hearth. Bid the stranger rise now, and let a chair be given him and supper set before him." Then Alcinous took Odysseus by the hand and raised him from where he sat, and bade his son Laodamas give place to him. He sat on a chair inlaid with silver, and the housedame brought him bread and wine and dainties. He ate, and King Alcinous spoke to the company and said, "Tomorrow I shall call you together, and we will entertain this stranger with a feast in our halls, and we shall take counsel to see in what way we can convoy him to his own land." The captains and councillors assented to this, and then each one arose and went to his own house. Odysseus was left alone in the hall with the King and the Queen. Now Arete, looking closely at Odysseus, recognized the mantle he wore, for she herself had wrought it with her handmaids. And when all the company had gone, she spoke to Odysseus and said, "Stranger, who art thou? Didst thou not speak of coming to us from across the deep? And if thou didst come that way, who gave thee the raiment that thou hast on?" Said Odysseus, "Lady, for 7 and 10 days I sailed across the deep, and on the 18th day I sighted the hills of thy land. But my woes were not yet ended. The storm winds shattered my raft, and when I strove to land the waves o'erwhelmed me and dashed me against great rocks in a desolate place. At length I came to a river, and I swam through its mouth, and I found a shelter from the wind. There I lay amongst the leaves all the night long and from dawn to midday. Then came thy daughter down to the river. I was aware of her playing with her friends, and to her I made my supplication. She gave me bread and wine, and she bestowed these garments upon me, and she showed an understanding that was far beyond her years." Then said Alcinous the King, "Our daughter did not do well when she did not bring thee straight to our house." Odysseus said, "My lord, do not blame the maiden. She bade me follow with her company, and she was only careful that no one should have cause to make ill-judged remarks upon the stranger whom she found." Then Alcinous the King praised Odysseus, and said that he should like such a man to abide in his house, and that he would give him land and wealth in the country of the Phaeacians. "But if it is not thy will to abide with us," he said, "I shall give thee a ship and a company of men to take thee to thine own land, even if that land be as far as Euboea, which our men say is the farthest of all lands." As he said this Odysseus uttered a prayer in his heart: "O Father Zeus, grant that Alcinous the King may fulfil all that he has promised, and for that may his fame never be quenched, and that I may come to my own land." Arete now bade the maids prepare a bed for Odysseus. This they did, casting warm coverlets and purple blankets upon it. And when Odysseus came to the bed and lay in it, after the tossing of the waves, rest in it seemed wonderfully good. At dawn of day he went with the King to the assembly of the Phaeacians. When the princes and captains and councillors were gathered together, Alcinous spoke to them, saying, "Princes and captains and councillors of the Phaeacians, this stranger has come to my house in his wanderings, and he desires us to give him a ship and a company of men, so that he may cross the sea and come to his own land. Let us, as in times past we have done for others, help him in his journey. Nay, let us even now draw down a black ship to the sea, and put 52 of our noblest youths upon it, and let us make it ready for the voyage. But before he departs from amongst us, come all of you to a feast that I shall give to this stranger in my house. And moreover, let us take with us the minstrel of our land, blind Demodocus, that his songs may make us glad at the feast." So the King spoke, and the princes, captains and councillors of the Phaeacians went with him to the palace. And at the same time 52 youths went down to the shore of the sea, and drew down a ship and placed the masts and sails upon it, and left the oars in their leathern loops. Having done all this they went to the palace, where the feast was being given and where many men had gathered. The henchman led in the minstrel, blind Demodocus. To him the gods had given a good and an evil fortune, the gift of song with the lack of sight. The henchman led him through the company, and placed him on a seat inlaid with silver, and hung his lyre on the pillar above his seat. When the guests and the minstrel had feasted, blind Demodocus took down the lyre and sang of things that were already famous, of the deeds of Achilles and Odysseus. Now when he heard the words that the minstrel uttered, Odysseus caught up his purple cloak and drew it over his head. Tears were falling down his cheeks, and he was ashamed of their being seen. No one marked his weeping except the King, and the King wondered why his guest should be so moved by what the minstrel related. When they had feasted and the minstrel had sung to them, Alcinous said, "Let us go forth now and engage in games and sports, so that our stranger guest may tell his friends when he is amongst them what our young men can do." All went out from the palace to the place where the games were played. There was a foot race, and there was a boxing match, and there was wrestling and weight throwing. All the youths present went into the games. And when the sports were ending, Laodamas, the son of King Alcinous, said to his friends, "Come, my friends, and let us ask the stranger whether he is skilled or practised in any sport." And saying this he went to Odysseus and said, "Friend and stranger, come now and try thy skill in the games. Cast care away from thee, for thy journey shall not be long delayed. Even now the ship is drawn down to the sea, and we have with us the company of youths that is ready to help thee to thine own land." Said Odysseus, "Sorrow is nearer to my heart than sport, for much have I endured in times that are not far past." Then a youth who was with Laodamas, Euryalus, who had won in the wrestling bout, said insolently, "Laodamas is surely mistaken in thinking that thou shouldst be proficient in sports. As I look at thee I think that thou art one who makes voyages for gain, a trader whose only thought is for his cargo and his gains." Then said Odysseus with anger, "Thou hast not spoken well, young man. Thou hast beauty surely, but thou hast not grace of manner nor speech. And thou hast stirred the spirit in my breast by speaking to me in such words." Thereupon, clad as he was in his mantle, Odysseus sprang up and took a weight that was larger than any yet lifted, and with one whirl he flung it from his hands. Beyond all marks it flew, and one who was standing far off cried out, "Even a blind man, stranger, might know that thy weight need not be confused with the others, but lies far beyond them. In this bout none of the Phaeacians can surpass thee." And Odysseus, turning to the youths, said, "Let who will pass that throw, and if any of you would try with me in boxing or wrestling or even in the foot race, let him stand forward anyone except Laodamas, for he is of the house that has befriended me. A rude man he would surely be who would strive with his host." All kept silent. Then Alcinous the King said, "So that thou shalt have something to tell thy friends when thou art in thine own land, we shall show thee the games in which we are most skilful. For we Phaeacians are not perfect boxers or wrestlers, but we excel all in running and in dancing and in pulling with the oar. Lo now, ye dancers! Come forward and show your nimbleness, so that the stranger may tell his friends, when he is amongst them, how far we surpass all men in dancing, as well as in seamanship and speed of foot." A place was levelled for the dance, and the blind minstrel Demodocus took the lyre in his hands and made music, while youths skilled in the dance struck the ground with their feet. Odysseus, as he watched them, marvelled at their grace and their spirit. When the dance was ended he said to the King, "My lord Alcinous, thou didst boast thy dancers to be the best in the world, and thy word is not to be denied. I wonder as I look upon them." At the end of the day Alcinous spoke to his people and said, "This stranger, in all that he does and says, shows himself to be a wise and a mighty man. Let each of us now give him the stranger's gift. Here there are 12 princes of the Phaeacians, and I am the 13th. Let each of us give him a worthy gift, and then let us go back to my house and sit down to supper. As for Euryalus, let him make amends to the stranger for his rudeness of speech as he offers him his gift." All assented to the King's words, and Euryalus went to Odysseus and said, "Stranger, if I have spoken aught that offended thee, may the storm winds snatch it and bear it away. May the gods grant that thou shalt see thy wife and come to thine own country. Too long hast thou endured afflictions away from thy friends." So saying, Euryalus gave Odysseus a sword of bronze with a silver hilt and a sheath of ivory. Odysseus took it and said, "And to you, my friend, may the gods grant happiness, and mayst thou never miss the sword that thou hast given me. Thy gracious speech had made full amends." Each of the 12 princes gave gifts to Odysseus, and the gifts were brought to the palace and left by the side of the Queen. And Arete herself gave Odysseus a beautiful coffer with raiment and gold in it, and Alcinous the King gave him a beautiful cup all of gold. In the palace the bath was prepared for Odysseus, and he entered it and was glad of the warm water, for not since he had left the island of Calypso did he have a warm bath. He came from the bath and put on the beautiful raiment that had been given him, and he walked through the hall, looking a king amongst men. Now the maiden Nausicaa stood by a pillar as he passed, and she knew that she had never looked upon a man who was more splendid. She had thought that the stranger whom she had saved would have stayed in her father's house, and that one day he would be her husband. But now she knew that by no means would he abide in the land of the Phaeacians. As he passed by she spoke to him and said, "Farewell, O stranger, and when thou art in thine own country, think sometimes of me, Nausicaa, who helped thee." Odysseus took her hand and said to her, "Farewell, daughter of King Alcinous. May Zeus grant that I may return to my own land. There every day shall I pay homage to my memory of thee, to whom I owe my life." He passed on and he came to where the princes and captains and councillors of the Phaeacians sat. His seat was beside the King's. Then the henchman brought in the minstrel, blind Demodocus, and placed him on a seat by a pillar. And when supper was served, Odysseus sent to Demodocus a portion of his own meat. He spoke too in praise of the minstrel, saying, "Right well dost thou sing of the Greeks and all they wrought and suffered, as well, methinks, as if thou hadst been present at the war of Troy. I would ask if thou canst sing of the wooden horse that brought destruction to the Trojans. If thou canst, I shall be a witness amongst all men how the gods have surely given thee the gift of song." Demodocus took down the lyre and sang. His song told how one part of the Greeks sailed away in their ships, and how others, with Odysseus to lead them, were now in the centre of Priam's city, all hidden in the great wooden horse, which the Trojans themselves had dragged across their broken wall. So the wooden horse stood, and the people gathered around talked of what should be done with so wonderful a thing, whether to break open its timbers, or drag it to a steep hill, and hurl it down on the rocks, or leave it there as an offering to the gods. As an offering to the gods it was left at last. Then the minstrel sang how Odysseus and his comrades poured forth from the hollow of the horse and took the city. As the minstrel sang, the heart of Odysseus melted within him, and tears fell down his cheeks. None of the company saw him weeping except Alcinous the King. But the King cried out to the company, saying, "Let the minstrel cease, for there is one amongst us to whom his song is not pleasing. Ever since it began the stranger here has wept with tears flowing down his cheeks." The minstrel ceased, and all the company looked in surprise at Odysseus, who sat with his head bowed and his mantle wrapped around his head. Why did he weep? Each man asked. No one had asked of him his name, for each thought it was more noble to serve a stranger without knowing his name. Said the King, speaking again, "In a brother's place stands the stranger and the suppliant, and as a brother art thou to us, O unknown guest. But wilt thou not be brotherly to us? Tell us by what name they call thee in thine own land. Tell us, too, of thy land and thy city. And tell us, too, where thou wert born on thy wanderings, and to what lands and peoples thou earnest. And as a brother tell us why thou dost weep and mourn in spirit over the tale of the going forth of the Greeks to the war of Troy. Didst thou have a kinsman who fell before Priam's city, a daughter's husband, or a wife's father, or some one nearer by blood? Or didst thou have a loving friend who fell there, one with an understanding heart who wast to thee as a brother?" Such questions the King asked, and Odysseus, taking the mantle from around his head, turned round to the company. End of Section 18. Of the Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy, by Padraic Colum. Part 2, Chapter 4. Then Odysseus spoke before the company and said, "O Alcinous, famous King, it is good to listen to a minstrel such as Demodocus is. And as for me, I know of no greater delight than when men feast together with open hearts, when tables are plentifully spread, when wine-bearers pour out good wine into cups, and when a minstrel sings to them noble songs. This seems to me to be happiness indeed. But thou hast asked me to speak of my wanderings and my toils. Ah, where can I begin that tale? For the gods have given me more woes than a man can speak of. But first I will declare to you my name and my country. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, and my land is Ithaca, an island around which many islands lie. Ithaca is a rugged isle, but a good nurse of hardy men, and I for one have found that there is no place fairer than a man's own land. But now I will tell thee, King, and tell the princes and captains and councillors of the Phæacians the tale of my wanderings. The wind bore my ships from the coast of Troy, and with our white sails hoisted we came to the cape that is called Malea. Now if we had been able to double this cape we should soon have come to our own country all unhurt. But the north wind came and swept us from our course and drove us wandering past Cythera. Then for 9 days we were borne onwards by terrible winds and away from all known lands. On the 10th day we came to a strange country. Many of my men landed there. The people of that land were harmless and friendly, but the land itself was most dangerous. For there grew the honey-sweet fruit of the lotus that makes all men forgetful of their past and neglectful of their future. And those of my men who ate the lotus that the dwellers of that land offered became forgetful of their country and of the way before them. They wanted to abide forever in the land of the lotus. They wept when they thought of all the toils before them and of all they had endured. I led them back to the ships, and I had to place them beneath the benches and leave them in bonds. And I commanded those who had ate of the lotus to go at once aboard the ships. Then, when I had got all my men upon the ships, we made haste to sail away. Later we came to the land of the Cyclops, a giant people. There is a waste island outside the harbour of their land, and on it there is a well of bright water that has poplars growing round it. We came to that empty island, and we beached our ships and took down our sails. As soon as the dawn came, we went through the empty island, starting the wild goats that were there in flocks and shooting them with our arrows. We killed so many wild goats there that we had 9 for each ship. Afterwards we looked across to the land of the Cyclops, and we heard the sound of voices, and saw the smoke of fires, and heard the bleating of flocks of sheep and goats. I called my companions together and I said, "It would be well for some of us to go to that other island. With my own ship and with the company that is on it I shall go there. The rest of you abide here. I will find out what manner of men live there, and whether they will treat us kindly and give us gifts that are due to strangers, gifts of provision for our voyage." We embarked and we came to land. There was a cave near the sea, and round the cave there were mighty flocks of sheep and goats. I took 12 men with me and I left the rest to guard the ship. We went into the cave and found no man there. There were baskets filled with cheeses, and vessels of whey, and pails and bowls of milk. My men wanted me to take some of the cheeses and drive off some of the lambs and kids and come away. But this I would not do, for I would rather that he who owned the stores would give us of his own free will the offerings that were due to strangers. While we were in the cave, he whose dwelling it was returned to it. He carried on his shoulder a great pile of wood for his fire. Never in our lives did we see a creature so frightful as this Cyclops was. He was a giant in size, and what made him terrible to behold, he had but one eye, and that single eye was in his forehead. He cast down on the ground the pile of wood that he carried, making such a din that we fled in terror into the corners and recesses of the cave. Next he drove his flocks into the cave and began to milk his ewes and goats. And when he had the flocks within, he took up a stone that not all our strengths could move, and set it as a door to the mouth of the cave. The Cyclops kindled his fire, and when it blazed up, he saw us in the corners and recesses. He spoke to us. We knew not what he said, but our hearts were shaken with terror at the sound of his deep voice. I spoke to him, saying that we were Agamemnon's men on our way home from King Priam's city, and I begged him to deal with us kindly, for the sake of Zeus, who was ever in the company of strangers and suppliants. But he answered me, saying, "We Cyclops pay no heed to Zeus, nor to any of the gods. In our strength and our power we deem that we are mightier than they. I will not spare thee, neither will I give thee aught for the sake of Zeus, but only as my own spirit bids me. And first I would have thee tell me how you came to our land." I knew it would be better not to let the Cyclops know that my ship and my companions were at the harbour of the island. Therefore I spoke to him guilefully, telling him that my ship had been broken on the rocks, and that I and the men who were with me were the only ones who had escaped utter doom. I begged again that he would deal with us as just men dealt with strangers and suppliants. But he, without saying a word, laid hands upon 2 of my men, and swinging them by the legs, dashed their brains out on the earth. He cut them to pieces and ate them before our very eyes. We wept and we prayed to Zeus as we witnessed a deed so terrible. Next the Cyclops stretched himself amongst his sheep and went to sleep beside the fire. Then I debated whether I should take my sharp sword in my hand and, feeling where his heart was, stab him there. But second thoughts held me back from doing this. I might be able to kill him when he slept, but not even with my companions could I roll away the great stone that closed the mouth of the cave. Dawn came, and the Cyclops awakened, kindled his fire and milked his flocks. Then he seized 2 others of my men and made ready for his midday meal. And now he rolled away the great stone and drove his flocks out of the cave. I had pondered on a way of escape, and I had thought of something that might be done to baffle the Cyclops. I had with me a great skin of sweet wine, and I thought that if I could make him drunken with wine, I and my companions might be able for him. But there were other preparations to be made first. On the floor of the cave there was a great beam of olive wood which the Cyclops had cut to make a club when the wood should be seasoned. It was yet green. I and my companions went and cut off a fathom's length of the wood, and sharpened it to a point, and took it to the fire and hardened it in the glow. Then I hid the beam in the recesses of the cave. The Cyclops came back in the evening, and opening up the cave drove in his flocks. Then he closed the cave again with the stone, and went and milked his ewes and his goats. Again he seized 2 of my companions. I went to the terrible creature with a bowl of wine in my hands. He took it and drank it and cried out, "Give me another bowl of this, and tell me thy name that I may give thee gifts for bringing me this honey-tasting drink." Again I spoke to him guilefully, and I said, "No man is my name, no man my father and mother call me." "Give me more of the drink, No Man," he shouted, "and the gift that I shall give to thee is that I shall make thee the last of thy fellows to be eaten." I gave him wine again, and when he had taken the 3rd bowl he sank backwards with his face upturned, and sleep came upon him. Then I, with 4 companions, took that beam of olive wood, now made into a hard and pointed stake, and thrust it into the ashes of the fire. When the pointed end began to glow, we drew it out of the flame. Then my companions laid hold on the great stake, and dashing at the Cyclops, thrust it into his eye. He raised a terrible cry that made the rocks ring, and we dashed away into the recesses of the cave. His cries brought other Cyclops to the mouth of the cave, and they, naming him as Polyphemus, called out and asked him what ailed him to cry. "No man," he shrieked out, "no man is slaying me by guile." They answered him, saying, "If no man is slaying thee, there is nothing we can do for thee, Polyphemus. What ails thee has been sent to thee by the gods." Saying this, they went away from the mouth of the cave, without attempting to move away the stone. Polyphemus then, groaning with pain, rolled away the stone and sat before the mouth of the cave with his hands outstretched, thinking that he would catch us as we dashed out. I showed my companions how we might pass by him. I laid hands on certain rams of the flock, and I lashed 3 of them together with supple rods. Then on the middle ram I put a man of my company. Thus every 3 rams carried a man. As soon as the dawn had come, the rams hastened out to the pasture, and as they passed Polyphemus laid hands on the first and the third of each 3 that went by. They passed out, and Polyphemus did not guess that a ram that he did not touch carried out a man. For myself, I took a ram that was the strongest and fleeciest of the whole flock, and I placed myself under him, clinging to the wool of his belly. As this ram, the best of all his flock, went by, Polyphemus, laying his hands upon him, said, "Would that you, the best of my flock, were endowed with speech, so that you might tell me where no man who has blinded me has hidden himself." The ram went by him, and when he had gone a little way from the cave, I loosed myself from him and went and set my companions free. We gathered together many of Polyphemus' sheep, and we drove them down to our ship. The men we had left behind would have wept when they heard what happened to 6 of their companions. But I bade them take on board the sheep we had brought, and pull the ship away from that land. Then, when we had drawn a certain distance from the shore, I could not forbear to shout my taunts into the cave of Polyphemus. "Cyclops," I cried, "you thought that you had the company of a fool and a weakling to eat. But you have been worsted by me, and your evil deeds have been punished." So I shouted, and Polyphemus came to the mouth of the cave with great anger in his heart. He took up rocks and cast them at the ship, and they fell before the prow. The men bent to the oars and pulled the ship away, or it would have been broken by the rocks he cast. And when we were further away I shouted to him, "Cyclops, if any man should ask who it was set his mark upon you, say that he was Odysseus, the son of Laertes." Then I heard Polyphemus cry out, "I call upon Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son I am, to avenge me upon you, Odysseus. I call upon Poseidon to grant that you, Odysseus, may never come to your home, or, if the gods have ordained your return, that you come to it after much toil and suffering, in an evil plight, and in a stranger's ship, to find sorrow in your home." So Polyphemus prayed, and, to my evil fortune, Poseidon heard his prayer. But we went on in our ship rejoicing at our escape. We came to the waste island where my other ships were. All the company rejoiced to see us, although they had to mourn for their 6 companions slain by Polyphemus. We divided amongst the ships the sheep we had taken from Polyphemus' flock, and we sacrificed to the gods. At the dawn of the next day we raised the sails on each ship, and we sailed away. Section 19. The Adventures of Odysseus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy, by Padraic Colum. Part 2, Chapter 5. We came to the island where Aeolus, the Lord of the Winds, he who can give mariners a good or bad wind, has his dwelling. With his 6 sons and his 6 daughters, Aeolus lives on a floating island that has all around it a wall of bronze. And when we came to his island, the Lord of the Winds treated us kindly, and kept us at his dwelling for a month. Now when the time came for us to leave, Aeolus did not try to hold us on the island. And to me, when I was going down to the ships, he gave a bag made from the hide of an ox, and in that bag were all the winds that blow. He made the mouth of the bag fast with a silver thong, so that no wind might drive us from our course could escape. Then he sent the west wind to blow on our sails, that we might reach our own land as quickly as a ship might go. For 9 days we sailed with the west wind driving us, and on the 10th day we came in sight of Ithaca, our own land. We saw its coast, and the beacon fires upon the coast, and the people tending the fires. Then I thought that the curse of the Cyclops was vain, and could bring no harm to us. Sleep that I had kept from me for long I let weigh me down, and I no longer kept watch. Then, even as I slept, the misfortune that I had watched against fell upon me. For now my men spoke together and said, "There is our native land, and we come back to it after 10 years' struggles and toils with empty hands. Different it is with our lord Odysseus. He brings gold and silver from Priam's treasure chamber in Troy, and Aeolus too has given him a treasure in an ox hide bag. But let us take something out of that bag while he sleeps.' So they spoke, and they unloosed the mouth of the bag, and behold, all the winds that were tied in it burst out. Then the winds drove our ship towards the high seas and away from our land. What became of the other ships I know not. I awoke and I found that we were being driven here and there by the winds. I did not know whether I should spring into the sea and so end all my troubles, or whether I should endure this terrible misfortune. I muffled my head in my cloak and lay on the deck of my ship. The winds brought us back again to the floating island. We landed, and I went to the dwelling of the Lord of the Winds. I sat by the pillars of his threshold, and he came out and spoke to me. 'How now, Odysseus?' said he. 'How is it thou hast returned so soon? Did I not give thee a fair wind to take thee to thine own country, and did I not tie up all the winds that might be contrary to thee?' 'My evil companions,' I said, 'have been my bane. They have undone all the good that thou didst for me, O King of the Winds. They opened the bag and let all the winds fly out. And now help me, O Lord Aeolus, once again.' But Aeolus said to me, 'Far be it from me to help such a man as thou, a man surely accursed by the gods. Go from my island, for I will do nothing for thee.' Then I went from his dwelling and took my way down to the ship. We sailed away from the island of Aeolus with heavy hearts. Next we came to the Aeaean island, where we met with Circe, the Enchantress. For 2 days and 2 nights we were on that island without seeing the sign of a habitation. On the 3rd day I saw smoke rising up from some hearth. I spoke of it to my men, and it seemed good to us that part of our company should go to see were there people who might help us. We drew lots to find out who should go, and it fell to the lot of Eurylochus to go with part of the company, while I remained with the other part. So Eurylochus went with 22 men. In the forest glades they came upon a house built of polished stones. All round that house wild beasts roamed, wolves and lions. But these beasts were not fierce. As Eurylochus and his men went towards the house, the lions and wolves fawned upon them like house dogs. But the men were affrighted and stood round the outer gate of the court. They heard a voice within the house singing, and it seemed to them to be the voice of a woman, singing as she went to and fro before a web she was weaving on a loom. The men shouted, and she who had been singing opened the polished doors and came out of the dwelling. She was very fair to see. As she opened the doors of the house, she asked the men to come within, and they went into her halls. But Eurylochus tarried behind. He watched the woman, and he saw her give food to the men. But he saw that she mixed a drug with what she gave them to eat, and with the wine she gave them to drink. No sooner had they eaten the food and drunk the wine than she struck them with a wand, and behold, the men turned into swine. Then the woman drove them out of the house and put them in the swine pens, and gave them acorns and mast and the fruit of the cornel tree to eat. Eurylochus, when he saw these happenings, ran back through the forest and told me all. Then I cast about my shoulder my good sword of bronze, and bidding Eurylochus stay by the ships, I went through the forest and came to the house of the Enchantress. I stood at the outer court and called out. Then Circe the Enchantress flung wide the shining doors and called to me to come within. I entered her dwelling, and she brought me to a chair and put a footstool under my feet. Then she brought me in a golden cup the wine into which she had cast a harmful drug. As she handed me the cup, I drew my sword and sprang at her as one eager to slay her. She shrank back from me and cried out, "Who art thou, who art able to guess at my enchantments? Verily thou art Odysseus of whom Hermes told me. Nay, put up thy sword and let us two be friendly to each other. In all things I will treat thee kindly." But I said to her, "Nay, Circe, you must swear to me first that thou wilt not treat me guilefully." She swore by the gods that she would not treat me guilefully, and I put up my sword. Then the handmaidens of Circe prepared a bath, and I bathed and rubbed myself with olive oil, and Circe gave me a new mantle and doublet. The handmaidens brought out silver tables, and on them set golden baskets with bread and meat in them, and others brought cups of honey tasting wine. I sat before a silver table, but I had no pleasure in the food before me. When Circe saw me sitting silent and troubled, she said, 'Why, Odysseus, dost thou sit like a speechless man? Dost thou think there is a drug in this food? But I have sworn that I will not treat thee guilefully, and that oath I shall keep.' And I said to her, 'O Circe, Enchantress, what man of good heart could take meat and drink while his companions are as swine in swine pens? If thou wouldst have me eat and drink, first let me see my companions in their own forms.' Circe, when she heard me say this, went to the swine pen and anointed each of the swine that was there with a charm. As she did, the bristles dropped away and the limbs of the man were seen. My companions became men again, and were even taller and handsomer than they had been before. After that we lived on Circe's island in friendship with the Enchantress. She did not treat us guilefully again, and we feasted in her home for a year. But in all of us there was a longing to return to our own land, and my men came to me and craved that I should ask Circe to let us go on our homeward way. She gave us leave to go, and she told us of the many dangers we should meet on our voyage. End of Project Gutenberg